Hi, welcome to the Decomposing Flower podcast. I'm your host, Jen. With me is Kira. In this podcast, we discuss all sorts of different cases, mysteries, and topics. In today's episode, we are going to be talking about the Black Plague, and I kind of want to mention a little bit before we get into this that today is actually our very first episode back. We haven't recorded in a while. Obviously, for you, it will not matter. But I also wanted to mention that because we haven't mentioned in our previous episodes that we do have like a form in our link tree or in the description where if you have like a case or a topic that you would like for us to talk about, you can fill it in or you can just comment below. But I just kind of wanted to mention that. Today's episode's going to be a little bit different. We are going to be talking about the Black Plague. Since there is like so many people died from this, I don't have like a direct person we're going to be talking about. So, before we begin, let me just give a little bit of some content warnings. We are going to be talking about obviously death, plagues, nasty bodily fluids, sickness, stuff like that, like really lack of medical knowledge, kind of like nasty medieval treatments, if that makes sense. And we actually are also going to be talking about some anti-Semitic stuff. So I just wanted to kind of give that a little bit of a warning. So if any of that is too much for you, you can click off or you can kind of watch until you don't want to. But yeah, so everything I found is from like scientific articles, researchers, stuff from like Harvard, even like writings from like people like that lived during this time. But I'm not a doctor, so if I say anything like medically wrong or just anything wrong, just let me know. So with that, I think we can begin. The reason I wanted to talk about the Black Plague is because I was remembering when Kira and I were in 8th grade, and I'm sure Kira remembers this, but we were learning about the bubonic plague. And Kira and I wrote a story about, I think it a doctor? I don't remember.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was about a doctor named Lawrence Guy, like Altair or something.
Yeah.
Because we were obsessed with Assassin's Creed at the time, of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah. And we like, I think we wrote a story about like our wife getting the disease and we had to like carry her body.
Oh my God, so traumatic. Yeah, we like put her body in like this crate and watched it go off into the sunset.
And I remember because we were like, I think Kira was like crying as she was writing that.
I was. Yeah,
But
there was like a part where like we got doc marks. I remember on this because we were like, oh, he went to the bathroom and he noticed she was on the ground vomiting, and the teacher was like, actually, there wasn't actually bathrooms. It was a chamber pot.
yeah, I remember that because I was like, I had that in my notes that we kept getting so much information wrong. Like, I think we did good on it, but we had a lot of stuff wrong. But
For eighth grade, yeah, we fucking killed it.
yeah, I mean that was like Kira and I. Like, I had a little bubonic plague phase, if that's like the correct thing. Maybe it was more the plague doctors because, like Kira
Yeah.
said, dude, we loved Assassin's Creed and they had the plague doctors in there and I always had like that little phase, but I actually like didn't know a lot of shit that happened. As I did my research for this episode, there was so much shit that I didn't even know that happened, and that might just be me being a dummy. So this might not be any new information to you maybe, but I just like I love learning history. I like learning how like humans have changed, and I mean, I I wonder what people are going to think of how we treated COVID like 100 years from now. They might be like, oh my god, like they didn't know anything. But yeah, I'm gonna try and do my best to not make this sound like I'm giving a school report. I'm gonna try and make this interesting, and like I said earlier, I'm not a doctor, so I really hope that I don't sound dumb when I do this. But so the Black Plague or the bubonic plague is a type of bacteria infection. Now, I do not, there's going to be so many words in this episode that I'm probably going to say wrong because I do not know how to speak English, even though it's my native language. It's called, it's called Yersinia pestis. I don't even know if I'm saying that
Crushed
right.
it.
Yeah, yeah. Researchers basically have said that this is kind of the ancestor to all diseases in humans. Now, I'm not a doctor. I can't fact check that. I don't know, but I saw that in a couple articles, so I hope that's right. So, the Black Plague, it wiped out 1/3 of Europe from 1347 to 1351, which that year does not even seem real to me. Like, every time I look at history and I'm like, oh yeah, there were people who were living in like the year 88. Like, what? Side note, sorry, I got a little off topic. The Black Plague didn't exactly start in 1347 and it didn't end in 1351. It kind of was in Asia around like 2,000 years prior, and some researchers actually think that it began as early as like 3000 BC, but the first kind of areas that it did infect was like China, India, Persia, which is now Iran, Syria, and Egypt. So the Europeans had actually heard of the Black Plague, or I mean, I don't think it was even called that at the time, but they'd heard of this like disease going around in other areas like in like Asia and stuff like that. And they called it like the Great Pestilence, but they kind of looked at it as a rumor. In my notes, I had written down that they didn't give a shit, but I don't think that's true. I feel like they were just like really poor, and they also didn't have like means to do anything about it. Like they didn't have Dr. Mike telling them what to do. I'm sorry. I only mention that because I remember during COVID, which I'm sorry again if I keep mentioning COVID, but I would watch Dr. Mike religiously because I was so scared. Yeah, so they kind of like they had heard of it like around like 5 years prior to before it hit Europe. So the first strain is said to have started in Mongolia, which then spread to like the west and like the Black Sea region. So one of the very first outbreaks, though, in Europe was in a Genoese, again, I'm so sorry if I'm saying that completely wrong, in Crimea. I might say this man's name wrong, I'm so sorry. There was this military leader. His name was Yanni Beg. I don't know if I'm saying it right. He and his army were in Kaffa in Crimea in 1347. They were fighting against the Italians and the Genoese defenders, and they were losing. They were not doing good. On top of it, a lot of his soldiers were just dying from this mysterious plague, which was the Black Plague. But they didn't know. It's unknown how they kind of got the Black Plague, but the Black Plague was from rodents and stuff, but it was probably from like traveling through like Asia and then rats and being in ports and stuff like that.
Didn't they have like shit everywhere?
Oh yeah. It was nasty. I mean, people were not clean. And, you know, just thinking about that time era and then being on a boat, just it would have been nasty. So this guy, he knew he was losing. He wasn't going to win this battle, but he needed to do one final act. And this is like one of the very first recorded biological warfares. So he actually took some of his soldiers that were dying or were dead that were infected with the Black Plague, and he catapulted their bodies over the walls where the Genoese defenders were, and then just spread the infection there, which that's how it was kind of spreading. And then he just left. He was just like, okay, see ya, and then he left. And yeah. And so all these like Genoese defenders and these Italians and all these people, you know, they were trying to get rid of these bodies. They were doing whatever they could, but obviously it was too late. Pretty much they all had to leave, and they all got on boats and they were like, we're leaving. We got to get out of here. And some of them were already dying. So we kind of arrive in October of 1347. And this is kind of where, like, in most research is where, like, people talk about the Black Plague and where it began. But on October 12th, there was 12 ships that were also known as the death ships that arrived in Italy. And most of the crew was either dead, dying, or they looked like they were dead or dying, or they were just incredibly sick. And they were covered in these like lumps and boils that were just oozing out blood and pus, and there was this nasty smell. Now just imagine like the nastiest smell ever plus like diarrhea and just being sick, like not So that was like the one thing with the Black Plague, was like the smell was like the most nasty. I mean, I don't think it was the nastiest part, but it was very like ugh. But the authorities were pretty much like, oh, no, you guys need to leave. And they just sent them off, and they were like, you can go. It didn't really matter if these ships were to show up anyways, because the plague was going to happen sooner or later, since like traveling and trade and all that was so common back then. There was just like no way to avoid it. It was too late anyways. Everyone was pretty much infected by the time they saw these guys, because it was airborne. You could get it through the air, through bites from infected fleas on rats or animals. But like, it could get on animals, and if you held the animal, it would get onto your clothes, and then if you went into the marketplace, you would spread it. Pretty much, it didn't matter. Like, if you just brushed shoulders with somebody, you would get it. It was too late. And then obviously some people were asymptomatic, so they might have already had it and not know they had it, and then it's too late, they infect a bunch of people. As simple as just touching someone's shoulder, even if you just like try and shimmy past them, you were gonna get sick. It was really popular in places that were very busy or had lots of people, and a lot of people were living in these like unsanitary homes. They would share beds. They didn't bathe. They would bathe like maybe once or twice a year. Hey, side note, this is me editing this. I don't know why I said they didn't bathe, because that is not true. Peasants actually did bathe like maybe once a week. It's kind of a myth that they were really dirty, but they just didn't bathe the way we do. They just kind of, sometimes it was more for occasions, but they still were a lot more unsanitary. People were smelly, nasty, and then on top of it, like, they didn't have their little hand sanitizer in their tote bag to like wash their hands. Like, they and then also the ports where they would bring in a bunch of like goods and stuff were very bad to be in. So it was fast. It usually would take you up to 3 to 5 days to just kill you. If you were lucky, or maybe considered unlucky, you could survive 1 to 2 weeks, but most likely you were dying within like 5 days. If you were to survive past 2 weeks, you pretty much were probably going to live, unless you were dying from other symptoms. So some people could just like be healthy because they were like asymptomatic, and then they could just die the next day. You wouldn't even know. Like, they would go to home and then they wouldn't wake up. They're just gone. It usually started off with like a fever, chills, and then your lymph nodes would be swollen, usually around your armpit or your groin, and they could be like the size of baseballs or apples. And
holy crap.
yeah, and they were painful. And then they would also ooze out blood and pus, and like they were like black, and it was so painful. And then on top of it, people were just getting other factors like diarrhea, upset stomach. They didn't have Pepto-Bismol. So, and then that would obviously lead into death. Most people like just died from being weak. It kind of attacked your lymphatic system. I don't know if I'm saying that right. It would cause your lungs to swell, and then the infection would spread to your blood and to your lungs. And because they didn't have like, antibiotics, they would just die. A lot of doctors believe that most people were dying from being like dehydrated and like other aspects and other diseases that were coming into play. It's kind of like during COVID, when like people were dying, but then they were like, oh, well, it's also this. But it was basically like the bubonic plague would just come in there and it would speed run your death. And yeah, it was not good. And also, like, for a lot of people that were also like dying, it could have been that you had like heart disease, or you had autoimmune issues, or you were getting other things. And so, like I said, people were just dirty and nasty, and it caused this thing to spread, and people began to panic, and there was a lot of misinformation, and this is where people would flee towns to get away from it, and this is where it would spread to other areas in Europe and other countries and stuff like that. So yeah, there was pretty much, you were not safe. There was a few countries and places that were safe, that were kind of cut off from Europe, and actually Scotland was safe from it until like 1353, until their army came home and then killed them all, pretty much. But yeah, pretty much no one was safe, even if like the wealthy and the royals. King Edward III, his daughter died from it. So yeah, It didn't matter. It pretty much just killed you. A lot of like marketplaces were like the worst place to be in, like I said, and they began to like close shop. There was a lot of like lack of wool and resources, and this is where towns began to become like ghost towns. And it wasn't until like World War I, I believe, where they actually found a few ghost towns that were from the 1300s, from when people would leave. Now, I tried to look for an exact picture because I saw a lot of people talking about this picture, but there's a lot of ghost towns in Europe. And every single time I was trying to find a ghost town and see like where nature overtook, there's just so many, like from all different wars and different plagues and like even the world wars and all that. So I couldn't find an exact one, but if I do later, if you're watching this while it's a video, um maybe there will be a picture on, but I can't guarantee that. But if you are interested in looking at ghost towns, just look at Europe ghost towns. They're very interesting. But yeah. um so they tried really hard to stop this, but obviously they didn't have like a lot of medical knowledge. They would try doing inspections on boats, but I don't really know how far that really went. They began to put a lot of restrictions on wine from like places they didn't know. Now, one thing I read was wine was kind of seen as a cure, and I don't know if that's just something that like a bunch of alcoholics like just came up with, but they believed like just getting drunk would make you safe. I feel like that that's me too though. Like, oh yeah. Like I know red wine, yeah. I think red wine can like be beneficial for you, but it's not a cure. That's something I would have done too. Like,
Feels so healthy.
yeah. I need that vodka. I need it. So they did try a few different things. They had this one like vinegar mixture. It was called Four Thieves vinegar. It was mixed with like herbs, garlic, and spices, and of course vinegar. And they would like spread that all over their bodies. And then they also would bathe in rose water. They also would kind of carry like vinegar around and like just wash their hands with it. Now, vinegar can be used as like a preventative, but it's not a cure. But they thought it was a cure. They also would like rub raw onion all over their like boils. Now, if you're eating, I suggest you put your food down for a second. They would actually mix feces with like other stuff, and they would spread it all over their body, which is so nasty, which obviously would have spread more diseases and bacteria, which would have killed more people off. Another nasty thing that they would do is there were people called plague eaters, and they would eat infected material and thinking that that would help their immunity. Now, I'm not a doctor. I don't think that worked. But another common one is a thing called bloodletting. They would either use a leech or a knife, and they would like cut like your vein or something, which obviously they didn't even have like a lot of medical knowledge with that. And they would try and drain out your bad blood, thinking that your good blood would stay inside you and that the bad blood would go into a bowl and like they could just like toss it out. But obviously this made people very weak. They already were weak, and then they're losing blood, and so people were dying. Pretty much a lot of the things they were trying to do just killed people off more. Another one, which this is a little bit like a little content warning for animal cruelty, but they would actually cut snakes up and place them on like people's bodies because they really believed snakes were evil, and they kind of thought the plague was like an evil spirit, and so they looked at snakes like attracts like, and that these snakes would just take out the evil spirits, but obviously that didn't work out. They really did not like snakes at this time. But I think that's so sad to me, like thinking of poor Snake, like, oh my god. And yeah, it's just so sad. Another common one, which kind of worked more so, was burning the infection, which would actually turn into them burning houses with some people that were still inside that were either sick or alive. They actually did this for the Pope. They didn't burn the Pope, but they like surrounded him with torches, and it kind of kept the disease away. Pretty much the best way that they needed to do was quarantine, but a lot of them were not properly quarantined. They weren't really doing a lot of that, but basically killing off rats was probably like the best way, but people were just getting so sick and then they were just fleeing. Most people would die alone because people were very afraid for their own like safety and their own immunity. So if someone was sick, they didn't even want to be around them. There was this one Italian poet. His name was Giovanni. I'm gonna butcher his last name. Boccaccio. I don't know if that's how you say it. It's Italian. I'm so sorry. Um, but he actually had written down that each thought to secure immunity for himself. So basically, people only thought for themselves, and they just they really did not care like if their loved one had it. They were like, I'm out. Because there was like a lack of medical knowledge, most attempts were just not working, and then people would spread rumors or misinformation. It would just result in people dying, and doctors began to not want to help people. They started to avoid people. They wouldn't take in people, and doctors were, wanting to make sure they don't die, and then they also were dying too. So there wasn't a lot of doctors. So that's when plague doctors kind of enter in the scene. Plague doctors, they were government officials, or they were just doctors that didn't have a lot of patience. They could be students, they could be volunteers, but they were actually paid more than the average doctor because they obviously needed an incentive. Plague doctors are a little bit iconic. Like I said in the very beginning, I loved plague doctors. Like when I played Assassin's Creed, I'd be so obsessed with going to the doctor because you would see the plague doctor and you'd be like, oh my god, look at his beak, he looks so cool. But yeah, dude, I had my little plague doctor phase, okay? But so they wore like their iconic like wax coat and gown or whatever it would have been, with they had leggings that had boots attached to it, which okay, like interesting. They would wear like their gloves and their hats, and then they had their famous beak mask. And this mask was made of glass or crystals that would protect the eyes. So the reason they would wear this giant beak mask is because of the smell. They actually believed if you would smell the plague that you would be infected and you would just die off. And so they would actually fill the beak with like herbs and flowers such as like lavender and mint. And then they would also soak sponges with vinegar to kind of hide and mask that smell. They also would carry around like different cures. One was called theoretic. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it was basically opium and vinegar mixed together. And yeah, so doctors now say like their apparel was pretty much flawed, obviously, but it did help them with not catching fleas, or if someone was like vomiting or something like that, they wouldn't get like the body fluids. They also carried around, I said staffs, but I don't think they're like staffs, they're like tongs to like pick at people or like pick up their clothes and burn them. But yeah, the plague doctors though, they didn't really do a lot of medical treatment. They did a little bit, but their main goal was to record symptoms, numbers of infections and deaths. They kind of were witnessing wills. They were writing down everything, doing autopsies, and then trying to find new ways to prevent the plague. And then they also were doing like the bloodletting, like I mentioned earlier. They also would like have prescriptions, which I don't know what these were made of, but it would basically induce vomiting and urinating. But a lot of people didn't have a lot of fluids, so this was actually making people pretty weak, and then they would die. A lot of their knowledge though was very superstitious. So one doctor had actually written, instantaneous death occurs when the spirit escaping from the eyes of the sick man strikes the healthy person standing near and looking at the sick. So basically they thought that the plague was just a spirit, and that if you were just like looking at someone with a disease, that it would just like leave them and then it would go inside of you. They also thought that what caused the plague was people who were evil or miserable, or that they had some kind of sin, or God was like punishing you for something. And so a lot of people use this as a way to, like, they thought they were being punished, so people would kind of avoid each other. They would turn on themselves, their friends, their family, their neighbors, and it would result to like violence and like trying to burn people, kill people. And they just kind of believed like God was punishing them for this, so they didn't care. And so there actually was these types of people that would kind of go around to towns and they would publicly beat and whip themselves to show like a statement to God for him to like forgive them. And so they would do this, beat themselves like crazy. Like, I think they were trying to mimic like when Jesus was here and he was being beat. I'm not too sure. They would beat themselves and then they would just pack up and go to the next town and they would keep doing this. Side note, God became very unpopular during the Black Plague and even like a couple centuries because the like Catholic Church was, I think they had a lot of power at this time, and they also were going around to like the sick and trying to heal them and then telling them like God's gonna help you or whatever. But when God was like, they weren't being healed, the plague was still here, they kind of started to turn away from like faith beliefs and more like methodical or logical beliefs. It actually wasn't until Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, but a different Martin Luther, who actually changed like the Protestant church, which I think he created the Lutheran church or whatever it's called. But another belief is they believed that God was punishing them for a couple reasons, and it was because of Jewish people. So they would refer to Jewish people as killers of Christ. Now, I'm not going to give you like a Bible story, but basically in the Christian faith belief, when Jesus was on earth and he was about to be crucified, the Romans had asked the Jews if they should crucify Jesus, and the Jews said yes because they believed he was a false prophet. So these Europeans would look at these Jewish people like they were killers of Christ and that God was punishing them. But the more popular belief was Jewish people are very, very clean and they are less likely to get sick. They weren't being infected. And they would actually bathe like pretty regular. They just were very clean people. I think it's their custom to be clean. And I think they would also like bury their dead when they would die. And a lot of Europeans, like during this time, like people weren't burying their dead because there were so many people. So the Jewish people were able to like kind of stop the disease from spreading from that. But the Europeans believed that the Jewish people were actually poisoning the wells and killing all the Europeans. And so they were kind of like, oh my God, the Jewish people are obviously not being infected because they're doing this. And instead of like, having a conversation, being like, hey, why are you guys not being infected? They probably could have learned to like, maybe bathe. They resulted into like killing them. And there was like one incident where they like killed around like 40 Jewish people. They would wipe out like communities of Jewish people. They would even like force Jewish people to confess to doing this through torture. So obviously like they were like falsely saying that they were doing this, but it was because they were being tortured. And because of this, just there was more violent outbreaks towards Jewish people. And some Jewish people were actually able to flee to safer regions where there wasn't as much as this, like Poland and stuff. But there were places where the plague hadn't even infected them. They would just kill them. And there was like this one day on Valentine's Day in 1349 where 2,000 Jews were literally burned alive. And then the people who killed them just took all their valuables and then just kept them. A lot of Jewish people ended up taking their own lives so that they could avoid being murdered. And so they didn't just have the Black Plague to be afraid of. They also had these murderous Europeans coming after them. That's something that I did not know happened during the Black Plague. I did not know that. It kind of, with the Black Plague, there was a lot of like bad and then there were some good things, but a lot of people were dying. And like I said, shops were closing down. And a lot of these landlords or landowners, they didn't really have people helping their field. Farmers were dying. Animals could also get the Black Plague, and so they were dying. And so with less food and wool and resources, people were getting freaked out. The economy started to crash, and this caused a lot of fear. And now the feudalism system actually began to crash. Before the plague, Europe was very overpopulated, and so feudalism was very normal. But now, with a lack of people, these landlords, they kind of had to rely on serfs. They weren't just considered an asset, but they were a way for people to rely on them for food. And so serfs now and peasants and all that, they were able to actually request and ask for higher wages and better working conditions because they needed it to be ideal for them to work. And because there wasn't that many people, the landlords were kind of like, okay, I guess we'll let you guys actually get paid properly. And so serfs were now like not tied to a master, but they could just leave, and that these landlords could just hire someone else. Women also were able to work because men were dying, and before, women were pretty much just seen as baby makers and like homemakers or whatever you would call that. They weren't really seen as like people who would work. They weren't even seen as people. But because men were dying off, women were now being relied on. So there was like a few things that were kind of good with the Black Plague, but not like, at least people were making money. You know, serfdom was kind of coming to an end. There was also like conflicts and wars that were put on hold. So people also were becoming rich. So someone could be like dirt poor, but because their family member died, now they have all their assets and they have all this money. And the rich and the nobility class really hated that. They hated seeing that these people were also becoming rich, and they also hated that like people were also seen as equal, and they needed to come up with new ways to make themselves seem better and higher. So a lot of like these European rulers, they began to like freeze worker wages, and in 1351 they made it illegal to refuse work if you were healthy, which you can imagine it probably was like, oh, you don't have the Black Plague, you're fine. So there probably was a lot of people that were like disabled, maybe even like it didn't look like they were physically disabled or sick or something like that, and they probably would be beat for not doing that or just jailed or killed. They would punish a lot of workers if they asked for higher wages, and they would make them stand in the stocks, which is like that thing where you put your head and your hands through, like the whole thing, or they would get branded on their face. And it was just kind of a way for the rich to like mock them. The rich were like pissed because they were like, oh my god, they want to work for money. They don't actually care about serving us. Like, they were mad that these poor serfs were like, can I actually afford money so I can buy bread? They were like pissed at them because they didn't want to serve these asshole rich people. This kind of was like, a lot of this stuff kind of like went down to peasants and like a lot of like riots and revolutions. And it wasn't until like 1380, which is jumping a bit ahead, where the whole like serfdom and the feudal system ended. But it wasn't really until like centuries later where things actually made a lot of change. So like I said, people were getting rich really fast, and because of that, the super rich people were like, no, we gotta show off that we're more rich than these rich people. And so they would actually use clothes and fashion as more of a statement to kind of mock the poor people, to be like, oh, you can't wear our fashion, like, look at us. They would even like dress their horses up. So like they were just like trying to do whatever they could to seem better. They needed to be like the rich. So yeah, there was a huge class divide. Food was becoming crazy expensive. People couldn't even afford to eat it all. People couldn't even do burials. People couldn't do anything. A lot of this did kind of cause people to go through a huge depression. Obviously, this would be pretty traumatic. People were just dying. You know, your family member just left you alone to die, and maybe you didn't even die. And a lot of people struggled with survival's guilt too. There was one Italian poet where he had actually written to his brother, who had survived 35 other people, I would, my brother, that I had never been born, or at least died before these times. And so a lot of people were really struggling with that, like, survival's guilt, I guess, because you're probably like, why did I survive this? So roughly around 1/3 of Europe was wiped off the planet by 1351. It's estimated to be anywhere between 70 million or 200 million people, which is 200 times higher than COVID. It's kind of theorized what stopped the Black Plague is just killing off rats, people dying, which meant not as many people being infected, and people who also had strong immunity who would then carry on their genes to healthier people. So while I was doing this episode, or like researching, I was kind of like looking into like how people actually survived the Black Plague, because it pretty much seemed like you weren't gonna make it. So I found this study. So in like 2014, there were a bunch of these researchers that went to this London cemetery. It was called East Smithfield Cemetery. They took the DNA from a bunch of bodies to do this experiment. So they had a question, which was, did the Londoners who survived the Black Death carry a mutation in their genes that protected them from this disease? So the reason they went to this location, it was because it was used between 1348 and 1349, and it was a place where King Edward III bought some land just to bury people who died from the Black Plague, because there was like so many people, there wasn't any space, and there was roughly around like 700 bodies just in this grave alone. And so the researchers, they knew the ages and the time frame of these bodies, and so they extracted the DNA from here. They also went to Denmark, and they actually had like 3 groups. They took DNA from before, during, and then after, and they actually looked at the genes in the immune system, and they found that some of these genes had mutated 4 times, and these mutations actually gave people 40% more of an advantage to survive the Black Plague. And a lot of Europeans to this very day carry this gene. But according to Lewis, I don't know how to say his last name. I'm going to put it on the screen. I'm so sorry. I don't want to butcher his last name. He had said that this mutation came at a cost, because a lot of the people who had this variant also have an increased risk with Crohn's disease today. So the very same gene that helped your ancestors with the Black Plague also gives you Crohn's disease or other immune issues, autoimmune issues, which is so crazy to think of. A lot of researchers and that were also doing this study, they said this study is very limited because they only took places from London and Denmark, and they weren't able to go into places like Africa or places in Asia or even in other countries. And a lot of people who are very racist and are white supremacists have this belief that white Europeans have a higher advantage or are more superior than people in places like Asia or Africa or people of color. And so this one like scientist, like she was basically saying like this research, it's very bullshit, because racists will basically have used this study to be like, here's proof. And so they said it's not really a fair study because they only were able to look at 2 different groups of people in like very similar areas. But yeah, so the plague, it never really left. It slowed down. There were centuries where it would have outbreaks and then it would kind of go away, but as people began to have more children, they would have stronger immunity. And yeah, so the WHO, or the World Health Organization, says that the Black Plague actually still happens to this very day. There's roughly around 1,000 to 3,000 cases every year, but we have antibiotics, so people are pretty much safe to survive it. Pretty crazy, because I thought the Black Plague was kind of wiped off. Like, I didn't think people could still get it. But yeah, that's the Black Plague, and I hope this episode was kind of interesting, or was interesting. I find like every plague we've learned something new. I mean, with COVID we've learned stuff. H1N1, I remember when I had that. But I do wonder what like even like 700 years from now people will think of the way we treat some of our diseases now, if we'll be kind of like laughed at, because like it's easy to make fun of a lot of these Europeans for doing weird stuff, but they also just didn't know. But yeah, so if anything we said was incorrect or wrong, or you want to add to this episode, feel free to comment below. Or if you have an idea for another episode, let us know. And if you don't really like these type of episodes and you prefer more true crime or maybe more current events, please let us know. But anyways, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.